In September 1944, the American Army reached the German border for the first time. What it found had been built in 1938, 3,000 kilometers of fortifications stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea, concrete bunkers embedded in hillsides, walls 4 feet thick, anti-tank obstacles, pyramids of reinforced concrete in staggered rows close enough to stop a Sherman tank, minefields, artillery emplacements, machine gun positions with interlocking fields of fire. American soldiers gave them a name borrowed from a popular song, the Siegfried Line. Von Rundstedt had assessed the West Wall as more myth than reality. Its bunkers had been stripped of guns when Germany was winning and the Atlantic coast seemed more important. Its garrisons neglected. In August 1944, Hitler dispatched 20,000 workers, most of them boys between 14 and 16 years old, to reconstruct what 6 years of neglect had deteriorated. The workers had 40 days before the Americans arrived, but German engineers noted that the bunkers could not withstand the armor-piercing weapons modern warfare had developed since 1938. The West Wall had been designed for the War of 1938. General Courtney Hodges commanded the American First Army. He was 57 years old, methodical and careful, who had liberated Paris and driven through France at speeds German planners calculated were impossible. He looked at the map and saw a forest. The Hürtgen Forest occupied approximately 54 square miles of dense conifer woodland east of Aachen. Through the forest ran the approaches to the Roer River dams, large concrete structures whose flood control capacity gave whoever held them the ability to flood the Roer Valley and halt any Allied advance for days or weeks. Hodges needed the dams. The most direct route ran through the forest. He sent the army in. What happened next was the specific, grinding, terrible consequence of attacking a fortified forest in autumn and winter without the weapons and tactics to overcome its defenses. 88 days, 33,000 casualties. The advance measured in yards. German Field Marshal Walter Model had earned his reputation as Hitler's fireman, the commander called in to stabilize collapsing fronts on the Eastern Front. He understood the forest the way a chess player understands a position that cannot be attacked directly. The dense fir trees, planted in neat rows by German foresters over decades, created killing zones that artillery could not suppress. Tree bursts, shells detonating in the canopy and sending shrapnel downward, were more lethal than shells on open ground. The terrain funneled attackers into predictable routes that defenders had pre-registered with artillery. Model had not needed to be a genius to understand this. He had needed only to look at the trees. Hodges had looked at the map. The map showed the most direct route to the dams, straight through the forest. It did not show what tree bursts did to men who had no overhead cover. It did not show what mud did to tanks trying to move through terrain that channeled them onto predictable routes. It did not show what happened to supply lines in a forest where vehicles could barely move and the defenders had years of familiarity with every trail. The map did not show what the forest would do to the army that entered it. 88 days would show it instead. 400 miles to the south, General George Patton was looking at a different map. Patton commanded the Third Army, operating through the Lorraine and the Saar, different ground, different defenses, different tactical problems. He was also looking at the Siegfried Line. Not at the forest in front of it, but at the specific places where it was strong and the specific places where it was weak. He had a question that Hodges had not asked. Not, how do we attack the Siegfried Line where it is strong, but where is it weak? The answer would take months to act on. First, the Hürtgen would have to teach its lessons. The lessons were expensive. The 28th Infantry Division entered the Hürtgen Forest on November 2, 1944. The 28th was the Pennsylvania National Guard, the Keystone Division, named for the Keystone emblem on its shoulder patches. It had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, marched through Paris, crossed into Germany. Its soldiers were experienced. Its officers had survived the learning process that had transformed the American army from the force that had broken at Kasserine to the force that had driven across France in August. They were as prepared as any American division could be. In the Hürtgen, prepared was not enough. The forest neutralized everything the American army had learned to do well. Air power was useless in the dense canopy. Pilots could not see targets through the trees, and bombs detonating in the forest sent shrapnel in unpredictable directions. Artillery, the American Army's greatest strength, was diminished by the same problem. The tree burst that Model had identified as the forest's primary weapon worked in reverse too, but the Germans were dug in, protected by their bunkers and log-reinforced fighting positions. The Americans were attacking through open ground, exposed. Tank support was barely possible. The few roads through the forest were mined and covered by anti-tank guns. Armored vehicles attempting to move off-road bogged immediately in the autumn mud. The tanks that the American Army had learned to integrate with infantry in France and Belgium became liabilities in the Hürtgen. Too large for the trails, too vulnerable to mines, too easily stopped by fallen trees that German engineers had prepared as obstacles. The 28th Infantry Division spent 5 days attempting to capture the town of Schmidt. Schmidt sat on high ground east of the forest. Capturing it would give American artillery a commanding position over the approaches to the Roer dams. The plan was straightforward. 2 regiments would seize the high ground south of Schmidt, while a 3rd regiment drove directly into the town. On November 3rd, the 3rd Regiment reached Schmidt. The celebration lasted less than a day. German armor, Panzer IVs, and assault guns that the American command had not known were in the area counterattacked on November 4th. The American infantry in Schmidt had no effective anti-tank weapons in position. The tank destroyers that should have accompanied them had been delayed on the mined, cratered road through the forest. The infantry broke and ran, the entire advance collapsing in a rout that recalled, at the divisional level, the disaster at Kasserine 18 months earlier. In 5 days, the 28th Infantry Division lost 6,000 men, roughly half its combat strength. Some battalions were reduced to fewer than 100 effectives. The division that had marched through Paris was effectively destroyed as a fighting force and had to be pulled out of the line for reconstitution. General Hodges continued the battle. This was the part that historians, looking back at the Hürtgen, found most difficult to explain. The evidence that the forest was the wrong place to fight was available from the first weeks of the campaign. The casualties mounted. The gains were measured in hundreds of yards. The tactical situation did not change in ways that suggested the next attack would succeed where the previous one had failed. The German High Command in mid-October had been confident that the Americans would not be foolish enough to attempt another assault through the forest after initial reverses. They misread the extent of stubbornness in American leadership. The Americans kept attacking. 5 divisions entered the forest over the course of the campaign. The 1st, 4th, 8th, 9th, and 28th Infantry Divisions all took serious losses. The 9th Division was committed twice. One of its regiments engaged 3 separate times. By December 1944, the total American losses in the Hürtgen Forest campaign reached 33,000, more than the American Army had lost at Normandy. The Roer dams were still in German hands. The forest had won. Model had looked at the trees and understood what the trees would do to anyone who entered them. Hodges had looked at the map. The map had been wrong about what the forest was. The Siegfried Line was not one thing. The West Wall was 3,000 kilometers of fortifications built over 6 years in different periods by different engineers to different standards. In some sectors, it was formidable. In the Aachen Gap, the natural corridor through which armies had moved between France and Germany for centuries, the line had received priority construction. The approaches were covered, the bunkers interlocked. The forest that Hodges was attacking had been incorporated into a defensive system that used terrain as a weapon. In other sectors, the line was thin. The Saar region, where Patton's Third Army was operating, had sections of the West Wall that were incomplete, poorly sighted, or so lightly manned that they were more symbolic than functional. The terrain in Lorraine was different from the Aachen Gap, more open, better suited to the kind of armored warfare that American forces had mastered in France. Patton understood this. His intelligence officers had mapped the line's construction standards, identified sectors where the concrete was thinner, where the anti-tank obstacles were incomplete, where the garrison was lighter than maps suggested. He had also spent the autumn arguing with his supply chain. In late August, Patton's Third Army had run out of fuel. The rapid Allied advance had outrun the supply lines, and allocation had been weighted toward Montgomery's operation in the north. The Third Army had literally stopped, its tanks idling in fields waiting for fuel. Patton had been characteristically furious, arguing with supply officers, siphoning fuel from other armies when he could get away with it. But the fuel shortage had also given him something: time. Time that the First Army, constantly in contact with the enemy along the Aachen-Hürtgen front, did not have. Time that Patton used in the specific way that a commander who understood the value of preparation used it: to study the problem he was going to be given when the fuel arrived. While Hodges' First Army was fighting the Battle of the Bulge, Patton had been planning. His staff studying the West Wall, his engineers training for river crossings, his artillery studying German defensive positions. By January 1945, when the Bulge had been contained and the Allied front was stabilizing for the final drive into Germany, Patton had what he needed: a sector of the West Wall where it was thin, a plan to go through it, an army that had not been ground down in the Hürtgen Forest, and an enemy that had stripped that sector of defenders to feed the battles that Hodges had been fighting. The Hürtgen had cost Germany too. Model's gamble, that holding the forest would justify the resources committed to it, had succeeded in the tactical sense. The Americans had been stopped, bled, ground down. But it had also drained German reserves at a moment when those reserves were needed everywhere. Patton was about to benefit from that drain. Hodges' First Army had spent the autumn feeding divisions into the forest. Each division that went in came out weaker. The replacements were untrained, rushed from depots without the combat experience the divisions had accumulated over 2 years of fighting. Patton's Third Army had spent the same months moving, not always successfully. The siege of Metz had been slow and expensive. The Saar approach had produced its own frustrations. But it had not been fed into a killing ground that neutralized every advantage American forces had spent 2 years developing. It was ready. In a way that Hodges' army, emerging from the Hürtgen, was not. He found it in the Eifel, the hilly region south of the Hürtgen, between the Moselle River and the Belgian border. The West Wall in this sector had been built to a lower standard. The German garrison was thinner. Model had stripped it to reinforce the Hürtgen and the Bulge, gambling that the terrain would compensate for the reduced defenders. In early March 1945, Patton drove through the Eifel. The 4th Armored Division moved through terrain the map suggested was too difficult for armor. It moved anyway. In 4 days, 55 miles. The West Wall behind them was no longer relevant. The question that the Hürtgen raised, and that Patton's Eifel advance answered, was not about courage or firepower or the quality of individual soldiers. It was about terrain. The American Army of 1944 had been built for a specific kind of war. The war it had learned to fight in Tunisia, refined in Sicily, and mastered in France, was a war of movement, of combined arms on open ground, of armor and infantry and artillery working together, of air power striking targets that pilots could see from above. The doctrine was sound. The execution had become excellent. The Hürtgen Forest invalidated the doctrine entirely. In the forest, armor could not maneuver. Artillery could not suppress. Air power could not see. The combined arms that had made the American Army formidable in France became irrelevant in conditions that reduced everything to infantry fighting in dense woodland, measuring gains in hundreds of yards, feeding men into a killing ground that rewarded the defender, regardless of how many attackers were committed. This was what Model had understood when he looked at the trees. The forest was not a position to be attacked. It was a weapon to be used against whoever attacked it. The American command, for reasons that historians have debated ever since, did not fully grasp this until the evidence had accumulated at a cost of 33,000 casualties. The argument for attacking the Hürtgen was not unreasonable. The Roer dams were a genuine strategic requirement. If the Germans opened the dams while American forces were crossing the Roer River downstream, the resulting flood would trap those forces on the east bank and potentially destroy them. The dams had to be controlled before the Roer could be safely crossed. The most direct route to the dams ran through the forest. The flaw in this reasoning was not the conclusion, but the premise. The most direct route was not the only route. The dams could have been approached from the south, bypassing the densest part of the forest. The dams could have been attacked from the air. The concrete structures were large, fixed targets that precision bombing could have destroyed or rendered non-functional. The dams could have been seized later, after the broader Allied advance had outflanked the German position in the forest. These alternatives were discussed. They were rejected, or set aside, or simply not pursued with the urgency that the Hürtgen's cost warranted. Hodges continued to attack through the forest. Patton, watching from his sector, did not comment publicly on Hodges' decision. But Patton's operational approach in his own sector reflected a consistent philosophy that stood in contrast to what was happening in the Hürtgen. Find the weak point. Go through the weak point. Do not attack the strong point simply because it is in the way. The west wall was strong in the Hürtgen. It was thin in the Eifel. Patton went through the Eifel. The west wall was strong at Metz, the ancient fortified city that blocked the Moselle River crossing. It was thinner at crossings above and below Metz. Patton invested Metz with minimum forces and crossed the river elsewhere, eventually isolating the city and forcing its surrender without the direct assault that its fortifications had been designed to repel. The pattern was consistent. The west wall was not one thing. It was a system with strong points and weak points. The objective was not to defeat the strong points. The objective was to reach the Rhine. The Rhine could be reached by going through the weak points. Hodges had a different problem. His sector was the Aachen Gap, the natural invasion corridor that the Germans had fortified most heavily precisely because it was the most natural route. The forest was part of that fortification. The dams were a genuine requirement. The alternatives were less obvious in his sector than in Patton's. This is the honest accounting of the Hürtgen. Not that Hodges was foolish, but that the terrain he faced was the terrain the Germans had chosen to be strongest, and that the American doctrine for attacking fortified terrain was inadequate to the specific conditions the forest produced. The American army that had learned to fight in France had not fully learned to fight in the Hürtgen Forest. Patton had avoided having to learn that lesson. He had gone somewhere else. On the night of March 22, 1945, George Patton crossed the Rhine. He did it without telling anyone. The planned Allied crossing was Montgomery's Operation Plunder, scheduled for March 23rd to 24th. 3 armies, 5,000 artillery pieces, airborne landings, weeks of preparation. Montgomery had announced the date publicly. The world's press was positioned. Churchill was planning to attend. Patton's crossing at Oppenheim involved no preparatory artillery fire, no airborne operation, no announcement. His staff had been collecting assault boats since August 1944. His infantry crossed in rubber boats at 10 p.m. on March 22nd. By morning, a bridgehead was established. When Patton called Bradley to report the crossing, he was characteristically direct. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Bradley asked for more information. "I sneaked a division over last night. There are so few Krauts around there, they don't know it yet. So don't make any announcement. We'll do this on the quiet, and maybe we can get 2 or 3 divisions over before they wake up." 2 days before Montgomery's carefully prepared crossing. No artillery, no airborne, no announcement. Patton had found the place where the Rhine was weakest, the Oppenheim sector, where German defenses had been stripped to reinforce other points, and he had gone through it before the Germans could reinforce it. The same philosophy that had taken him through the Eifel, the same philosophy that had bypassed Metz. Find the weak point, go through the weak point. Go now, before the weak point becomes a strong point. The German commanders knew the Allied crossing was coming. The question was where. Montgomery's visible buildup in the north had told them one answer. They had concentrated their defenses accordingly. Patton had not announced anything. He had crossed where the Germans were not concentrated. The American losses at Oppenheim were 42 killed and 151 wounded. 42 men for crossing the Rhine. The statistics require context. In the Hürtgen Forest, the American army had spent 88 days and 33,000 casualties fighting for terrain that had never been essential to the strategic objective of reaching the Rhine. At Oppenheim, Patton crossed the Rhine itself, the last major geographic barrier between the Allied armies and the German heartland, for 42 killed. The point is not that Oppenheim was easy and the Hürtgen was hard. The point is that Patton had identified the easy place, had prepared for it, and had crossed there rather than at the hard place. The German officers defending the Rhine near Oppenheim were reportedly stunned, not by the crossing itself, but by the speed, by the absence of preparation, by the fact that Patton had moved before they could concentrate against him. General Patton's diary entry for March 22nd was characteristically understated. At 2200 hours we crossed the Rhine, and I must say I was well pleased with the performance. He then noted that he had deliberately not called Eisenhower or Bradley in advance to ensure nothing could be done to stop him. Speed as a weapon. Not speed for its own sake. Patton was not reckless. Speed as the exploitation of the gap between German recognition of a threat and German response to it. Responding to a threat required time. Patton's crossings did not give the Germans that time. The Hürtgen Forest had given the Germans 3 months. Oppenheim gave them 1 night. The difference in casualties was proportional to the time Patton gave the enemy to prepare. His staff had identified Oppenheim months before. Assault boats pre-positioned. Engineering units trained. When the moment came, the Third Army executed with the smoothness of a force that had rehearsed the operation. The German Army in March 1945 was capable of responding to threats, doing so competently in multiple sectors simultaneously. It had not been given time to respond at Oppenheim. An American officer inspecting the German defenses after the crossing reported that the positions were adequate. If they had been manned in strength, crossing would have been difficult. They had not been manned in strength. Patton had not given the Germans time to man them. The Siegfried Line had been designed to stop an army. It had not been designed to stop an army that refused to attack it. This was the strategic insight that the Hürtgen campaign illustrated in reverse, by demonstrating what happened when an army attacked the line where it was strongest, and that Patton's operations illustrated in the positive, by demonstrating what happened when an army found the line's weaknesses and exploited them before they could be reinforced. The German defensive strategy in the West had been built around the Westwall. The line would slow the Allied advance. It would impose casualties that the Allies could not sustain indefinitely. It would buy time for the German war machine to recover from the disasters of the summer. The Westwall did slow the Allied advance. The Hürtgen did impose casualties that the First Army could not easily absorb. But the strategy had not fully accounted for the asymmetry in how different American commanders responded to the fortified line. Hodges went into the forest and stayed there. Patton found the gap. The German planners had assumed a more uniform Allied response, that all the Allied armies would be constrained by the West Wall in roughly equal measure. The Hürtgen justified this assumption. The First Army had been contained. The Third Army had not been contained. In the Hürtgen, the Americans were contained, bleeding, but not advancing. The German commanders could manage it by feeding in reserves to replace defenders as they were ground down. Patton's advance through the Eifel and toward the Rhine was not something the German command could manage in the same way. He was moving through gaps, bypassing strong points, advancing faster than German reserves could be repositioned to respond. The German response was to strip forces from other sectors, including the Hürtgen, to reinforce the areas where the Third Army was threatening. Force the enemy to choose which sector to defend. Attack the sector the enemy has not chosen. The concept of bypassing strength and attacking weakness is as old as warfare. What was specific to Patton was the velocity of execution, the speed at which his intelligence identified the weak points, the speed at which his forces moved to exploit them, and the speed at which the exploitation was completed before the German command could respond. The Hürtgen had been fought at the enemy's preferred speed, the slow, attritional pace that favored the defender in prepared terrain. Patton's Rhine crossing had been fought at American preferred speed, rapid, opportunistic, exploitation-focused, favoring the attacker who is more mobile and operating with better intelligence. Both battles were against the same enemy. Both were part of the same campaign to cross the Rhine and enter Germany. One cost 33,000 casualties and 88 days. One cost 42 killed and 1 night. The West Wall was the same West Wall in both cases. The army was the same army. The difference was the question being asked. Hodges had asked, "How do we get through this?" Patton had asked, "Do we have to get through this?" J.D. Salinger served in the Hürtgen as an intelligence officer with the 12th Infantry Regiment. His regiment lost more than 2,500 men. Salinger's experiences contributed to the haunted quality of his post-war fiction, the unnamed horror that runs through his character. He had survived the place where the American army attacked the West Wall, where it was strongest. Patton's soldiers crossed the Rhine where it was weakest. Both were fighting the same war. The West Wall had been designed to create the difference. Patton had refused to let it. The German military had a concept for what Patton was doing. They called it Schwerpunkt, the point of main effort, the concentrated application of force at the decisive location. German operational doctrine had been built around Schwerpunkt since the reforms of the Prussian army in the 19th century. The genius of the concept was its clarity. Identify the point where success would be most decisive, concentrate everything there, and drive through before the enemy could respond. Patton was using Schwerpunkt against its inventors. He was identifying the German defensive line's weakest points, its own Schwerpunkt of vulnerability, and concentrating his effort there rather than at the points the Germans had prepared for him to attack. The Wehrmacht had built its operational success on attacking where the enemy was weakest. In France in 1940, the Ardennes offensive went through terrain the French considered impassable. In the Soviet Union, German formations found the seams between Soviet units and drove through them. Patton had learned the lesson the Wehrmacht had been teaching. He was applying it against the Wehrmacht itself. German commanders recognized what was happening. Their after-action reports described Patton's operations with the language of professionals who understood the technique. Rapid identification of weak points, concentration of force, exploitation before response was possible. They could not stop it. Not because they lacked tactical skill. German defensive operations in the Hürtgen demonstrated that the Wehrmacht retained formidable capabilities in prepared terrain against frontal assault. They could not stop Patton because Patton was not attacking their preparations. He was attacking the places they had not prepared. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding German forces opposing the Third Army in the final months, described Patton with the professional admiration and honest frustration that characterized German descriptions of their most effective opponents. Patton, von Manteuffel said, was the most feared American commander, not because he was the most powerful, not because he was the most methodical, but because he was unpredictable in his timing and unrelenting in his exploitation of weakness. The German defensive system depended on predictability. If an enemy was going to cross the Rhine, he would cross at an obvious point after a period of preparation that allowed German forces to concentrate. If an enemy was going to push through the West Wall, he would attack the main corridors, which were the most direct but also most heavily defended. He crossed the Rhine 2 days before the expected crossing, without artillery preparation, without announcement. The German defensive system was built for a predictable enemy. Patton was not that enemy. These were not tactical innovations. They were the application of military principles as old as Sun Tzu. What was new was the velocity, the speed at which Patton's army identified and exploited opportunities before the German defensive system could close them. Von Manteuffel's post-war assessment was unambiguous. Patton, he said, was the most dangerous. The Hürtgen had demonstrated what happened when the German defensive system worked as designed. Patton had demonstrated what happened when it didn't. Hürtgen, 88 days, 33,000 casualties, 54 square miles. Roer dams not seized until February 1945. Patton's Third Army, January to May 1945. Approximately 600 miles of advance, 21 German divisions destroyed or captured. The Rhine crossed in a single night. The same West Wall, The same winter, the same enemy. Different questions asked, different answers found. The West Wall failed in the end. In the sectors where it was manned and the terrain was favorable, it had performed as designed. The Hürtgen had demonstrated its effectiveness against the predictable attack on predictable terrain. The war was decided in the places that Patton went, through the Eifel, across the Rhine at Oppenheim, through the heart of Germany. The West Wall that Model's defenders held in the north did not prevent the war's conclusion. It simply meant the conclusion came from the south, through the sectors where the line was thinner. The German defense had won the tactical engagement in the Hürtgen Forest. It had lost the strategic contest across the rest of the front. The tactical outcome is not in question. The First Army was contained, bled, stalled. The German defenders achieved exactly what Model had intended. The strategic outcome is what historians argue about. If the First Army had not attacked the Hürtgen, if Hodges had waited for Patton's flanking movements to make the forest position untenable, would the war have ended sooner, with fewer casualties? These counterfactual questions cannot be definitively answered. What can be said is that the tactical victory the Germans achieved in the Hürtgen did not translate into strategic benefit. The American army that emerged from the forest, battered and depleted, was reconstituted and sent forward again. The Roer dams were eventually controlled. The Rhine was eventually crossed. The West Wall had not prevented any of this. It had made it more expensive. Not victory. By autumn 1944, German military leadership understood that victory was not available. The objective was to impose such costs on the Allied advance that a negotiated peace became politically possible. The calculation required the Americans to keep attacking the strong points. Patton had not cooperated. His crossing of the Rhine at 42 killed, published in the American press while the Hürtgen's 33,000 were still being counted, was not just a military achievement. It was a political statement. The war could be won without the grinding attrition the West Wall was designed to impose. The West Wall had been designed to make every advance equally expensive. It had succeeded in the Hürtgen. It had failed everywhere Patton went. Model had understood how to use the Hürtgen as a weapon. He had been right. The forest was a weapon. It had worked. He had not anticipated Patton. The German defensive strategy had been built around an assumption. American commanders would attack the obvious objectives by the obvious routes. Hodges had. He attacked the Hürtgen because the dams were there, and the most direct route went through the forest. Patton had asked a different question. Not, what is the most direct route, but what is the most effective route? The most direct route went through the forest. The most effective route went around it. Model had prepared for the most direct route. The most effective route had won. 42 killed. The Rhine crossed. Germany entered. The war on its way to being over. The West Wall had been built to make this impossible. Patton had not attacked the West Wall. He had driven around it, through it, past it, in the places it was not strong enough to stop him. And it had not stopped him. The most direct route went through the forest. Patton had found the route that was not the forest. The forest had held the First Army for 88 days. It had not held Patton, because Patton had never gone in. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. By that point, Patton's Third Army had advanced approximately 600 miles from its positions in the autumn of 1944, fighting through the Eifel, crossing the Rhine, driving through the heart of Germany, reaching the Czech and Austrian borders before the ceasefire. The Hürtgen Forest was still there, largely unchanged physically from what it had been in September 1944 when the First Army entered it. The trees that had created the killing zones were still standing. The German bunkers that had anchored the defense were still embedded in the hillsides, their concrete intact. The terrain that had neutralized American air power, artillery, and armor was still the same terrain. It had not been defeated. It had been bypassed. This is a distinction that matters for understanding what the West Wall actually was and what it was not. The question was not whether the West Wall could be taken. The question was what it cost to take it, in American lives, in time, in the specific human toll the German High Command had designed the West Wall to produce. The Hürtgen Forest demonstrated the cost when the American Army attacked the West Wall at its strongest. Patton's operations demonstrated the cost when the American Army identified the West Wall's weakest points and went there instead. Both approaches eventually reached the same destination. One arrived having paid 33,000 casualties for 54 square miles of forest. The other arrived having crossed the Rhine for 42 killed. The Siegfried Line had been designed to prevent the second outcome. It had been designed by engineers who understood fortification and had built a line that was genuinely formidable in many sectors. It had been manned by soldiers who understood the defensive advantages the terrain provided and who had used those advantages with professional skill. It had worked, in the Hürtgen, exactly as designed. What it had not been designed for was an opponent willing to say, "I don't need to take this position. I need to get to Berlin. Show me the route that doesn't go through the prepared defenses." Patton had demonstrated that such a route existed. The question to ask about a fortified line is not, how do we break through it? The question is, where is it not? Patton had asked that question since September 1944. He had kept asking it until the answers ran out, which they did in early May 1945, when there was no more Germany left to advance through. Model, whose use of the Hürtgen Forest as a weapon had been among the most effective defensive operations of the Western Front, did not surrender. On April 21, 1945, with Army Group B encircled in the Ruhr pocket and the situation clearly hopeless, he dissolved his command and walked into the forest. 3 days later, he shot himself. He had held the Hürtgen for 88 days. He had watched Patton go around him. He had seen the end that the Hürtgen's tactical success had not prevented. The First Army had gotten to Berlin, metaphorically, through a war that had included the Hürtgen. Patton had gotten there through a war that had not. Both routes had led to the same destination. One had passed through the forest, the other had gone around it. The German generals who had built their defense around the forest had been right that the forest was a formidable position. They had been wrong about one thing. It was not the only position. The West Wall had been designed to channel the American advance into prepared killing grounds. It had succeeded in the Hürtgen. It had failed in the Eifel, in the Saar, at Oppenheim on the Rhine. Because Patton had not used the channels, he had found the gaps. And the gaps, it turned out, were enough. The Hürtgen Forest is still there. A visitor today can walk through the same dense fir trees that killed 33,000 American soldiers in the autumn and winter of 1944. The terrain is unchanged. The ridges and ravines that channeled the attacks are still recognizable from the battle maps. Some of the German bunkers survive, their concrete worn but intact, half buried in the forest floor. The cemeteries are there too. The Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium holds 7,592 graves, many of them soldiers who died in the Hürtgen. It is one of the largest American military cemeteries in Europe. There is no equivalent monument to Patton's crossing at Oppenheim. 42 graves do not require a cemetery of 7,000. The asymmetry is not the point. The men who died in the Hürtgen did not die in vain. They held German forces in place, inflicted casualties the German army could not easily replace, prevented the German command from shifting forces to other sectors where Patton was advancing. There is an argument that the Hürtgen was not only unavoidable, but necessary. The argument may be correct. It does not change the arithmetic. 33,000 casualties, 42 killed. Both were crossings to Germany. Both were part of the same campaign. Both were fought by the same army, American soldiers, in the winter of 1944 to 1945, tired and cold, far from home, doing the specific work of ending a war that had been going on for years. Those soldiers did not choose their assignments. The men of the 28th Infantry Division who entered the Hürtgen in November 1944 did not choose the Hürtgen. The soldiers of the 5th Infantry Division who crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim did not choose Oppenheim. Their commanders made those choices, and the choices determined what the war cost them. The 33,000 casualties bought time, attrition, and constraint on German movement. The Oppenheim crossing bought momentum, territory, and rapid advance that complicated German planning in ways attritional warfare could not. The Siegfried Line had done what it was designed to do in the Hürtgen Forest. In the Eifel, it had not. At Oppenheim, it had not. The question is what it cost the Americans to fight in the Hürtgen rather than in the Eifel. Germany built the wall to stop the army. Where the army couldn't go around it, it fought through and paid the price. Where it went around, it paid almost nothing. It could not hold ground where the attacker was somewhere else. Germany built the wall to stop the Americans. America built an army that looked at the wall and asked, "Do we have to go through that?" And found often enough that the answer was no. Patton asked that question every time he encountered a prepared German position. Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes the answer was no. There was a gap, a flanking route, a sector where the west wall was thin and moving fast would cost less than attacking. The Hürtgen was a yes. The Eifel was a no. Oppenheim was a no. Germany built it to be a wall. Patton treated it as a problem to be solved. Some problems have frontal solutions. Some have lateral ones. Patton preferred the lateral. The wall stopped nobody. The army never slowed down. That was the difference. Hodges asked, "How do we get through this?" Patton asked, "Do we have to?" The answers produced two different wars. One produced the Hürtgen. One produced Oppenheim. Both produced Germany's defeat. Only one produced it for 42 killed. Germany built the wall to stop the army. Patton found the gaps. The wall stopped nobody. The army never slowed down. That was the difference.